"I ain't got nowhere to go, sir, but I can cook." Those were the words she whispered to the widowed rancher on a freezing Christmas Eve. It was December 24th, 1887, in Dust Creek, Wyoming Territory. The world was buried under a thin, cruel layer of snow that blanketed the narrow road leading into town. Dust Creek lay silent under a pale, iron-gray sky. The wooden buildings stood like tombstones, windows dark and shuttered against the wind that swept through the empty streets. It was a wind that didn't just blow. It whistled through the cracks of the boardwalks and sliced through clothing. Like a blade of pure ice, walking down that desolate road was a woman alone. Her head bowed low against the gale. Elmina Hartley was 28 years old, and in the span of 2 months, she had lost everything that defined her life. Her husband had passed away suddenly, leaving her with a grief that hadn't even had time to settle before the knock came at the door. It wasn't neighbors offering comfort, it was creditors. They brought papers filled with debts her husband had kept hidden, signatures that signed away her future. They took it all: the house, the land, the livestock, even her mother's wedding quilt. When she walked away, all she had was a fraying sack containing 3 items deemed too worthless to steal: a dented cast-iron pot, a worn wooden spoon, and a dull paring knife. Now, she was a stranger in Dust Creek, wandering into the loneliest night of the year with absolutely nowhere to go. She tried the first door she saw. There was a flicker of movement behind a curtain, a shadow of a face, and then nothing but silence. At the second house, a woman cracked the door just an inch, looked Elmina up and down with cold eyes, and snapped, "We don't feed beggars." The third attempt was even shorter. A man simply grunted, "No charity here. Try the mission." Before slamming the door, the snow began to sting her cheeks, and her breath came in ragged, shaky clouds. She reached the edge of the town square, near an old broken wagon, and her legs simply gave out. She sank to the frozen ground, her stomach clenched tight with hunger. Her hands, cracked and red from the cold, scraped together a meager pile of kindling twigs, straw, and debris. She had 1 match left. She struck it, praying it would hold. The flame wavered, threatened to die, and then caught. She balanced her dented pot over the small fire, melting a scoop of snow. Into the water, she added the absolute last of her provisions: a handful of dried beans, a pinch of thyme from her apron pocket, and a sliver of garlic she had hidden inside her boot. Finally, she shook in a few specks of pepper dot as the soup simmered. A scent began to rise. It wasn't the smell of a rich banquet, but it was something warm, faintly sweet, and undeniably real. It traveled on the wind like a whisper from another world, cutting through the sterile cold of the town. And someone noticed. From across the square, a figure emerged from the white haze. Wrapped in a heavy, worn wool blanket, he moved with a slow, deliberate gait. He was a Comanche elder, his face lined with the deep map of years and silence. He approached her fire and knelt without a word. "That," he said softly, "is the scent of someone who remembers." Elmina flinched, startled. "It's just soup, sir." The old man smiled faintly. "It is more than that." She offered him a spoonful. He accepted it, closing his eyes as he sipped. "My wife cooked like this," he murmured, the taste seemingly transporting him back in time. "It feeds the soul." Elmina found herself telling him everything: the death, the debts. The doors slammed in her face. The old man, Old Crow, listened with a comforting stillness. When she finished, he stirred the fire. "This town has no place for you," he said, "but there might be one elsewhere." He pointed toward the horizon. 12 miles northwest, there is a ranch called Red Hollow. The man who runs it, Caleb Ror, lost his wife 5 winters back. Since then, he has turned to stone. No one stays long. He looked at Elmina with intense eyes. "But you cook with memory. That might reach him. You think he'd let me work?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I think his heart is not dead," Old Crow replied. "Just waiting, not for hands, but for soul." He stood up and pulled a square of warm cornbread from his blanket, pressing it into her hands. "You are shaking. From cold, from fear. Both will pass. But if you keep cooking from the heart, a door will open." He turned and began to walk away. his form vanishing into the snow like a shadow swallowed by the wind. "Follow the ridge," he called back. "Go at dawn." Elmina sat alone beside her dying fire, clutching the warm bread to her chest. The wind still stung, and the snow kept falling. But deep inside her, beneath the exhaustion, something stirred. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was the shape of it. It was Hope. Red Hollow Ranch. Christmas morning, 1887. The sun had barely begun to bruise the eastern sky with pale light by the time Elmina reached the boundary of the ranch. Her legs felt like lead weights, and every step sent a jolt of fire through her blistered feet. The wind hadn't let up. It stung her face like 1,000 tiny needles, and the fresh snow from the night before had crusted over the ground, making the path treacherous and hard. But then, just past a line of skeletal cottonwood trees, she saw it. Long, sturdy wooden fences stretched out against the white landscape, surrounding a cluster of barns and a large, imposing log house just as Old Crow had described. Her breath caught in her throat. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the winter. She nearly collapsed reaching the final gate, but forced herself to shuffle up the path. To the main house, she raised a trembling hand to knock. But before her knuckles could graze the wood, the door creaked open. 2 ranch hands stood in the doorway, wrapped in heavy shearling coats, steam curling lazily from the tin coffee mugs in their hands. They blinked, their expressions shifting rapidly from surprise to suspicion, and finally settling on mocking amusement. "Well, would you look at this?" one drawled, tilting his head as he looked her over. "Did Santa drop you off on his way back?" "North, miss." The other man let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "This ain't a poorhouse, lady. We ain't got no room for strays here." Elmina couldn't speak immediately. Her tongue felt glued to the roof of her mouth from the cold. She knew what she looked like, her dress torn at the hem, her fingers clutching the frayed strap of her sack, her hair wild and wind-blown. She stood there like a ghost that had wandered too far from the night. One of the men smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "You sure don't look like you'd last 5 minutes in a Wyoming gust, let alone a winter." She took a breath, shallow and rattling in her chest. She summoned the very last reserves of her strength, looked the man in the eye, and forced the words out. "I ain't got nowhere to go, sir, but I can cook." A hush fell over the porch. The 2 men glanced at each other, the mockery fading into uncertainty. They didn't know how to answer that kind of desperation. But the decision wasn't theirs to make. Heavy, slow footsteps sounded on the wooden floorboards behind them. A new presence filled the doorway, blocking out the dim light from the hall. Caleb Ror appeared. He said nothing at first. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad, built like someone who had stopped asking the world for favors a long time ago. He stood there with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who has held too much weight for too long. His face was etched with the hard lines of silence and solitude. His eyes were dark and unreadable, shadowed not by fatigue, but by a profound absence, as if something vital had been carved out of him years ago and never replaced. He looked at Elmina. There was no pity in his gaze, but there was no anger either. He just looked. Elmina tried to stand straighter. Her knees were knocking together beneath her thin skirt, but she held his gaze. She wasn't defiant, and she wasn't begging. She was just there, steady, as if every tragedy in her life had funneled her to this single, frozen moment. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. Finally, Caleb spoke. His voice was a deep rumble. "Rough from disuse. You cook?" "Yes, sir." "Experience?" "Yes." Another pause. The wind whistled across the yard, lifting drifts of snow off the porch railing. The 2 ranch hands stood still, barely breathing, waiting for the dismissal. Caleb studied her face, looking for cracks, looking for weakness. He seemed to be trying to solve a riddle. He didn't remember asking. Then he nodded once. "Sharp 7 days." Elmina blinked, confused. "Sir, 7 days to prove you are worth feeding this crew." Caleb said flatly, "You cook, they eat. If they work better because of it, you stay. If not, you leave." Elmina swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her voice cracked when she answered, "Yes, sir." "It is not charity," he added, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I understand." He turned to the men, his tone shifting to command. "Show her the kitchen. Give her the back room. It is empty." One of the hands muttered a soft, "Yes, sir," and stepped aside to let her pass. Elmina stepped forward, almost stumbling as her frozen legs tried to navigate the threshold. As she passed Caleb, moving from the biting cold into the dim, warm hallway of the main house, she felt his gaze burning into her back. She didn't turn around. He watched her until the shadows of the house swallowed her small figure. Then, so low that no one could hear it but the empty hall and the ghosts of his past, he murmured to himself, "Christmas morning, and another lost soul at my door." The morning air bit through the cracks in the kitchen walls, and frost clung to the window panes like a second lace curtain. Elmina stood alone in the heart of Red Hollow's long-neglected kitchen. It was a dismal sight. Layers of gray dust coated the shelves, and the cast-iron pans hanging from the ceiling were orange with rust. The great stove's hearth was cold, filled with the ash of fires that had burned out long ago, and the wooden worktable bore deep scars and burns from meals made in haste and forgotten in apathy. She didn't waste a moment. She tightened the strings of her apron, set down her meager sack, and rolled up her sleeves. With a quiet, desperate purpose, she began to clean. She scrubbed the grime from the counters, scoured the rust from the skillets, and coaxed a roar of life back into the stove. By the time the sky outside had lightened to a steel gray, the kitchen had transformed. The fire crackled and popped, casting a golden glow over the room. But it was the smell that changed everything. The rich, savory scent of warm butter, frying garlic, and a hint of nutmeg drifted out of the kitchen and into the drafty hallway. Elmina worked with steady, practiced hands. She mixed flour and cornmeal into a thick, creamy batter, dropping spoonfuls onto the hot griddle until the edges crisped up into a perfect golden brown. She whisked eggs until they were light as air and sliced smoked pork thin, searing it with onions until the air shimmered with savory heat. She didn't rush. She cooked like a woman who believed that a hot meal was the only thing standing between a man and despair. When the ranch hands filed in from the yard, stomping heavy snow from their boots, the kitchen met them like a physical wall of warmth. They stopped dead at the threshold. The room fell silent. One man sniffed the air, blinking rapidly as if he had walked into a dream. Another scratched his beard, looking around in bewilderment at the order, the cleanliness, and the impossible smells filling the room. Elmina turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning," she said gently. "Breakfast is ready." For a heartbeat, no one moved. They were used to burnt coffee and hardtack. Then a tall, weathered man with a jagged scar down his cheek stepped forward. He picked up a tin plate, scooped up a serving of fluffy eggs and crisp bacon, added 3 corn cakes, and sat down. He took a bite. He froze. He chewed once, then again, his eyes widening. "Sweet Lord," he muttered, staring at his fork. "I thought I died and went to heaven." The spell broke. The others surged forward, loading their plates. The silence of the morning was replaced by the groans of satisfaction and the rhythmic scrape of forks against tin. Elmina watched from the hearth, saying nothing, simply refilling the platters as they emptied. The look of sheer relief on their faces was the only payment she needed. When the eating slowed, Jonas, the ranch hand who had first opened the door to her, approached a small table in the corner. On it sat a separate tray, neatly arranged corn cakes, eggs, and the garlic-fried pork, steaming gently next to a fresh mug of coffee. "I'll take this to the boss," Jonas said simply. He lifted the tray and carried it down the hall. In the dim study of the main house, Caleb Ror sat behind a massive oak desk cluttered with overdue bills and old survey maps. The fireplace was dark, the room cold. The only light came from a small oil lamp mounted on the wall. Jonas entered and set the tray down on the corner of the desk. "Cook sent breakfast," he said. Caleb didn't look up from the ledger he was reading. "Leave it." Jonas nodded and exited, closing the heavy door softly behind him. Caleb remained motionless for a long moment. He continued to stare at the paper before him, his brow furrowed. Then he paused. The scent reached him: onions, pork, the warm, earthy smell of nutmeg. He slowly set his paper down. He looked at the tray, he picked up a corn cake and took a bite. His expression didn't change. His face remained a mask of stone. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. He tried the eggs, then the pork. Nothing showed on his face, no smile, no nod dot, but when he finally set his fork down, his hand moved just slightly. It rested flat on the table, his fingers curling faintly against the wood, as if something long buried inside him had just woken up. He ate everything on the plate. When Jonas returned 20 minutes later to clear the tray, Caleb didn't glance up. He was back to his papers, but his voice, low and gruff, stopped Jonas at the door. "Tell her she did well, just that." Jonas nodded and left. Back in the kitchen, the mood had shifted entirely. The men were finishing up, scraping their plates clean. Some were even clearing the table without being asked. One of the younger hands laughed, clapping another on the back. "Best thing to happen to this ranch since clean water," he joked. Outside, the snow still fell, relentless and cold. But inside the kitchen, for the first time in 5 years, something warmer than fire had taken root. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, and Elmina began to find her place in the daily motion of Red Hollow. She rose long before the sun, preparing breakfast while the frost still patterned the windows, and she worked until the moon was high. Her food was doing more than just filling empty stomachs. It was mending something unseen in the men who sat at her table. For the first time in years, the bunkhouse wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place where men felt looked after. Most of the crew treated her with a simple, wordless respect. They nodded when she poured coffee and scraped their boots before entering. But kindness wasn't universal. 3 of the younger ranch hands had started lingering in the kitchen. Long after their plates were empty, their laughter was too loud, their eyes too wandering. The compliments started out clumsy, but quickly twisted into something darker. "Smells sweeter in here every day," one of them drawled, leaning against the doorframe with a toothpick in his mouth. He looked her up and down. "And I ain't talking about the biscuits." Elmina kept her back turned, her hands deep in bread dough, her jaw set tight. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. That another chimed in. "I bet she's softer than that dough, too." The third man let out a mean, sharp laugh. "Wonder if she gets lonely in that little back room. Maybe she needs some company." Elmina bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron. She focused entirely on her work shaping the dough, brushing it with butter, sliding the heavy tray into the oven. But the heat of the stove couldn't chase away the cold humiliation crawling up her spine. Then, one morning, the line was crossed. As she bent down to lift a heavy cast-iron pot from the hearth, one of the men stepped up right behind her, invading her space. "Well now," he whispered, his voice low and thick, "a girl like you shouldn't be working so hard. Why don't you let me help you unwind?" The words hit her like a physical slap. She stiffened, her heart hammering against her ribs, a mix of fear and white-hot anger welling up in her throat. Before she could speak, the kitchen door creaked open. Caleb Ror stepped inside. He didn't storm in. He didn't shout. He entered with the quiet, terrifying inevitability of a winter storm. The room instantly froze. Caleb's coat was dusted with fresh snow, and his boots struck the floor with heavy, deliberate echoes. He walked past the men and stopped at the long wooden table. He placed one large hand flat on the surface. The sound of his palm hitting the wood wasn't loud, but it silenced every breath in the room. "She cooks for you," Caleb said. His voice was low, devoid of volume but heavy with iron. He looked directly at the man standing behind Elmina. "So you can work, so this ranch can run." He paused, his eyes dark and unyielding. "She is not here for your entertainment. She is not here for your jokes, your eyes, or your hands." The ranch hand opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, then wisely snapped it shut. Caleb didn't blink. "One more word," Caleb continued, his voice dropping an octave, "and Red Hollow will no longer have a bed for you. Not tomorrow, not after supper, right now." The man swallowed hard, his face draining of color. "Yes, sir." Caleb swept his gaze over the other two. "Do I make myself clear?" A murmured chorus of yes, sir rippled through the room, only then did Caleb turn his head slightly toward Elmina. She hadn't moved. Her hands were still gripping the pot handle, Her breath caught in her chest. Their eyes met. For a split second, the hardness in his face fractured. Beneath the stone, there was a flicker of something else, concern, perhaps even an apology. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. Elmina blinked, exhaling a breath she didn't know she was holding, and lowered her eyes. Without another word, Caleb turned and walked out, letting the door click softly shut behind him. The kitchen remained dead silent. The men finished their meal quickly, eyes on their plates. When they left, they were polite, subdued. Elmina stood at the stove, her hands steady again. She realized then that she hadn't just been protected, she had been valued. In the weeks that followed, small things began to change. Elmina noticed that the door to her small room, which had always groaned on its hinges, now opened silently. The metal had been oiled, the wood sanded down. A few days later, a rug appeared beside her bed, deep burgundy, thick and warm against the drafty floor. And when the wind rattled her window, she found a sturdy new pull string on the curtains, tied with a careful, intricate knot. Caleb never said a word about them. He never asked for thanks, but he began to stop by the kitchen more often. The wood outside is wet, he said one morning, standing near the stove while the coffee brewed. I'll have Jonas bring a drier stack for the morning fire. Another time, he pointed to the stovepipe. The draft is pulling too much heat. I'll have it patched before noon. He never stayed long, and his words were always practical. But Elmina understood the language he was speaking. He was noticing the details of her life. In a world that had erased her, he was making sure she was comfortable. Do you always manage the ranch this closely? She asked him once, as they stood near the pantry. He shrugged, his eyes on the floor. Only when something needs doing, and a drafty oven needs doing, she teased gently. The corner of his mouth twitched the ghost of a smile. Cold food is bad for morale. Elmina laughed, and the sound seemed to startle him, but he didn't pull away. Slowly, quietly, the distance between the cook and the rancher was beginning to close. As the deep winter settled in, the conversations between Elmina and Caleb grew more frequent. Though they never lost their quiet reserve, they didn't speak in long monologues. Their words were shared in the spaces between the clatter of pans and the hush of falling snow. They spoke of the people who were gone. Caleb didn't say his wife's name, but he spoke of the absence she left behind, the rooms that once held music, now filled only with the dust of routine. Elmina spoke of her husband, peeling back the layers of her own tragedy. I don't think he meant to ruin us, she said softly one evening, slicing onions with the same dull knife she had brought from Dust Creek. He was just tired. And some men, they get reckless when they're tired for too long. Caleb nodded, watching the fire. Some do. Sometimes they talked of the world outside Red Hollow. They spoke of the changing West, of the railroads that cut through the plains without stopping, leaving towns like Dust Creek to shrink and wither. They spoke of what it meant to be people who worked with their hands in a world that was beginning to value speed over craft. We are the kind the world forgets, Elmina mused, wiping flour from her hands. Caleb looked at her, his gaze steady. And yet, here we are. They rarely looked at each other when they spoke deep truths. Their eyes stayed on the fire, or the floor, or the gray sky beyond the glass. But the words hung in the warm air like the smell of baking bread. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a shared understanding, something earned and solid. Both of them knew that something had begun. Then the weather turned. The wind began to rise just after nightfall. At first, it was a low, distant howl, the kind that whispers down the chimney and rattles the loose boards. But within the hour, it grew sharp and urgent. The kitchen windows shook in their frames. Outside, the snow was no longer falling. It was being driven sideways, forming massive drifts that could swallow a man's boot. In minutes, Elmina had just finished scrubbing the last pot when the back door burst open. Jonas stumbled in, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "Sir," he shouted over the roar of the gale. "The roof is lifting on the south cattle barn." Caleb was standing near the stove, arms crossed. He snapped to attention instantly. "How many head are inside?" 60, Jonas gasped. "We tried to brace it, but the wind turned." Without a word, Caleb strode to the door and grabbed his heavy coat from the peg. Elmina watched as he stepped out onto the porch, and then he stopped. The wind struck him like a physical wall. It screamed through the yard, dragging ice and snow like claws across the timber. Somewhere in the dark distance, a heavy, ominous thump echoed the sound of wood straining under impossible pressure. Elmina ran to the doorway just in time to see him hesitate. His shoulders went rigid. One hand gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes were locked on the distant, swaying outline of the barn. The structure was groaning, the walls bowing inward. The wind shrieked louder, blinding and brutal. Elmina saw the tremor in his hand. She saw the sudden stillness in his boots, and she realized with a jolt that this wasn't about the cold. It wasn't about the danger. It was memory. He had been here before. She had heard the story in whispers from the ranch hands. 5 winters ago, during a storm exactly like this one, his wife had gone out to the stables to save the horses. The roof had collapsed. She had died in the wreckage. Now, history was threatening to repeat itself. The storm was the same. The danger was the same. And Caleb was paralyzed by the ghost of that night. He couldn't move. But the barn was failing. Elmina didn't think. She pulled her scarf tight around her neck, wrapped a second shawl over her head, and plunged into the blizzard. Jonas and the other men were already at the barn, struggling with ropes, shouting to be heard over the roar. The main door flapped violently, the hinges screaming in protest. "We need to brace the west side." One man yelled, "No time." Another shouted back, "We'll lose the roof in minutes." Elmina grabbed a loose length of rope, tied it around a support post, and shouted into the wind, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Pull it against the wind. Anchor it low." The men looked at her, startled to see the cook in the middle of the storm. But her voice was firm, her eyes focused. "Move the cattle out the back," she ordered, gesturing wildly, "one at a time. Don't spook them. Fast, but quiet." She threw her weight against a beam, helping Jonas hold a ladder steady as he climbed to secure a tarp over the broken eaves. Her hands were freezing, bleeding from splinters and ice, but she didn't slow down. The barn shuddered violently, but it did not fall. Under Elmina's direction and the frantic work of the hands, the cattle were guided out through the rear gate. They moved one by one, lowing nervously, down toward the lower pen which sat shielded from the biting wind. When the last animal cleared the threshold, the roof gave a final, terrifying groan, settled onto the temporary braces, and held. The worst had passed. Inside the empty, echoing barn, Elmina sagged against the rough timber wall. Her breath came in sharp, white bursts. Her scarf was frozen stiff with ice. Her hair was soaked, and the hem of her skirt was heavy with mud and snow. But they had done it. No lives were lost. Nothing was broken except the silence of the night. She turned toward the entrance and found Caleb standing there. He was framed by the swirling snow, standing exactly where he had stopped when the memory seized him. Snow clung to his broad shoulders and matted his dark hair. His face looked like it had been carved from gray granite, motionless and cold, except for his eyes. They were alive with a chaotic mix of emotions, shame, relief, and a profound, terrifying awe. She stepped closer to him. Her lips were trembling, but not from the cold. "You froze," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple truth. He didn't deny it. He didn't look away. "I watched you from the door," he rasped. "I wanted to move. My legs wouldn't listen." "Because you remembered her," Elmina said softly. He remained silent, the wind howling around them. Elmina reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on his wet sleeve. "No one stays strong forever, Caleb," she murmured, using his given name for the first time. "Even stone cracks when the wind blows hard enough." For a long, suspended moment, he just looked at her. There was no defense left in him. Then, slowly, he gave a single, jerky nod. Something inside him, a dam that had held back 5 years of floodwater, began to fracture. Later, the snow was still falling, but the wind had lost its murderous edge. Caleb stood alone by the fence post outside the barn, staring out into the white abyss of the fields. The cattle were safe. The men were warming themselves in the bunkhouse. But the storm inside Caleb hadn't settled. Elmina approached him, carrying a small pail of water she had drawn for the horses. She paused when she saw him. He looked rigid, distant, a man haunted by the ghosts of the prairie. She set the pail down and wiped her hands on her apron. "Would you like some water, too?" she asked. He shook his head, staring at the ground. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things that had needed saying for years. At last, his voice broke the quiet. It was low, strained, tearing out of his throat. "5 winters ago," he began, "there was a storm just like this. My wife, she insisted we move the horses to the main barn. I told her the wind would pass. I told her it was too dangerous." His jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in his cheek. "She went anyway." He closed his eyes. "At dawn, we found her. The stable had collapsed. I tried to dig. I scraped at the wood and the ice until my hands were raw, but there was nothing left to save." The grief in his voice was fresh, raw, as if the years had vanished. "After that," he continued, looking at Elmina with hollow eyes, "I shut the doors. I locked the windows. I kept this ranch running because I had to, but I didn't keep it alive. I thought survival was enough." Elmina listened, letting the wind curl softly round them. When he finished, she picked up the pail and offered it to him again, not just water, but an offering of kindness. "You've carried that alone for a long time," she said. "Loss doesn't make a man weak, Caleb. It makes him tired. But even a tired man can wake up again." He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise piercing through his pain. "You lost someone, too," he said. She nodded slowly. "My husband wasn't a cruel man. He was just weak. He borrowed more than he could ever pay back and hid the truth from me. When he died, those debts destroyed everything we had. They took my home. They took my land." Her voice trembled, but her gaze remained steady. "But I realized something. I still know how to make something good from what's left in the pantry." Caleb's shoulders eased. The tension that had held him upright for 5 years seemed to drain away, leaving him human again. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His hand came up and rested gently on her forearm. It wasn't a grab for control. It was a connection. A man who hadn't touched another soul in years was finally reaching out. "Since you came here," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "this place, it smells like life again. I forgot that Red Hollow could have laughter." He met her eyes, and the darkness in them had lifted, replaced by the soft reflection of the snow. "Thank you." Elmina's breath caught in her throat. Her lips curved into a faint, uncertain smile, not a bold expression of joy, but something real and tentative. She didn't say anything. Words felt too small for the moment, too clumsy to bridge the gap between them. But her silence was full of meaning. They stood like that for a long time, two quiet figures etched against the white canvas of the snow, bound together by grief and the strange, terrifying possibility of moving forward. The air still bit with the ferocity of the Wyoming winter, but the silence between them had begun to warm. Then Caleb did something unexpected. That he reached inside his heavy wool coat and pulled out a scarf. It wasn't new. It was soft, faded, the colors muted by years of wear and time. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his thumb brushing the fabric, before he placed it into Elmina's hands. There were no words, no explanations. He didn't say, "This belonged to her." He didn't need to. The meaning was as clear as the ice on the eaves. It was an object he had held onto, a tangible piece of a past he couldn't let go of, and now he was passing it on. He was trusting her with the weight of it. Elmina looked down at the cloth, her fingers curling slowly round the weave. It felt fragile, like the moment itself. Beneath the vast winter sky, in the hush that follows a storm, something sparked. Between two souls who had convinced themselves they would never feel anything again. It wasn't a roaring fire, but it was light. Healing, quiet and real, had finally begun. 1 year later, snow fell gently on Red Hollow Ranch as night settled in, but this time, the darkness held no fear. A full year had passed since Elmina Hartley had arrived, cold, desperate, and starving, on that distant Christmas morning. The transformation was absolute. The kitchen, once a cold tomb of dust and neglect, now glowed with the golden warmth of candlelight and a roaring hearth. The long wooden table was set with a care that bordered on art. There was a platter of roasted venison, dark and savory, baskets filled with spiced carrots and fresh, steaming cornbread, and baked apples that glistened with sugar. On the windowsill, a pie cooled, sending the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg mingling with the crackle of the firewood. It was a feast fit for a king, prepared in a house that had once forgotten how to eat. Outside, the atmosphere was electric. The ranch hands had gathered on the porch of the bunkhouse. Someone had brought out a fiddle, and they were singing Christmas carols. They were out of tune, their voices rough and loud, but the sound was full of unbridled joy. Laughter rose through the snowy air, echoing across the quiet fields that had once been so silent. Inside the main house, Elmina made the final adjustments to the table. She straightened a folded cloth, adjusted a serving dish, and wiped a speck of flour from the edge of the wood. She looked different. Her hair was pinned back neatly, her apron was freshly pressed, and her cheeks held a healthy flush. She moved with a quiet, easy confidence. The trembling stranger who had stood on the porch begging for a chance to cook was gone. In her place was a woman who knew she belonged. She paused for a moment, listening to the bad singing outside, and a genuine smile touched her lips. She had built this, with flour and heat and patience. She had turned a house of stone into a home. Behind her, the heavy oak door to the hallway opened. Caleb Ror stepped into the room, pausing to brush the heavy snow from his coat. The man who stood there was different from the shadow who had haunted these halls a year ago. His shoulders, once bowed under the crushing weight of old grief, were squared and strong. He carried himself with a new kind of dignity, not the hardness of stone, but the resilience of a living tree. His eyes, no longer distant or guarded, found hers immediately across the candlelight. A long silence stretched between them. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but the heavy, charged quiet of two people who know exactly who they are to each other. Caleb spoke first, his voice dropping to a register that was meant for her alone, cutting under the noise of the wind outside. "The night you came here," he said slowly, "you told me you had nowhere to go." Elmina turned to face him fully, smoothing her apron. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Caleb looked down at his boots for a fleeting second, searching for the words, before lifting his gaze back to her face. "If you still feel that way," he said, "I would like you to know that Red Hollow could be that place, permanently." He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out something carefully folded. It was another scarf, but this wasn't the faded, time-worn wool he had given her out in the storm. This was new. It was a deep, rich red, the color of wine or winter berries, thick and impossibly soft. Without a word, he held it out to her. Elmina froze. She recognized the gesture for what it was. The old scarf had been a sharing of his past, a trusting of his grief. The scarf, this was for the future. It was chosen specifically for her, bought with intent, given with hope. With trembling hands, she reached out and accepted it. The wool was warm from being close to his chest. Caleb didn't offer a grand speech. He simply said, "This one is for you, for now." Emotion welled up in Elmina's chest, tight and hot. She blinked back the sudden sting of tears and whispered, "My road doesn't wander anymore, Mr. Ror. Not if you'll have me here." He didn't smile fully. Caleb wasn't a man of easy smiles, but something radiant reached his eyes. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in the gentlest way possible, and touched his fingers lightly to the back of her hand. It was a small, simple contact, but it carried more weight than 1,000 shouted declarations. Suddenly, the spell was broken by a roar of noise behind them. The kitchen door flew open and the ranch hands poured in, bringing the cold air and the loud music with them. They were singing, stomping snow from their boots, and raising their mugs in a chaotic toast to the holiday. The room instantly filled with noise, life, and the smell of wet wool and roasting meat. The warmth of the food and the fire wrapped around them all. But in that quiet, invisible circle between Elmina and Caleb, a different kind of fire had been kindled. Elmina draped the new red scarf over her shoulders, her fingers tracing the soft pattern of the weave. Caleb lingered for just a moment longer, his eyes holding hers, before he turned to join his men. He moved slowly, savoring the atmosphere, a man finally at peace with his own home. Elmina watched him go, then turned to look out the frosted window. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the Wyoming plains in a soft, forgiving light. She closed her eyes briefly and breathed in. She smelled the pine, the roast, and the future. For the first time in years, she felt steady. She felt found. And that is how a wandering cook with nothing but a pot and a prayer, and a stone-hearted widower trapped in the winter of his soul, found their way back to warmth on a cold Wyoming Christmas. Red Hollow Ranch stood quiet in the snow, but inside, something tender had finally begun to bloom, slow, steady, and strong. If this story stirred something in you, hit that like button and let your heart be counted. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of grit, grace, and romance that lingers like the last light over the prairie. Out here on the frontier, every love story leaves an echo. Stay with us. There's more trail ahead.